Also, one final site that really spans the woodland period, Morton Shell Mound in Iberia Parish, down along the coast on Weeks Island. It's actually a mound comprised of shell, that is to say, the discarded shell from meals that has been piled up over many, many centuries. That is to say, it's Chafuncta, Marksville, Coles Creek, what we would call a multi-component site, meaning people went there and continued going back there. And we're talking about more than a few generations. We're talking about basically from about 800 BC to about 700 AD. That would span those cultures right there, if not longer, actually into the Plaquemine period after that. And these are some of the sherds that I had mentioned down here on the right, that with the different decorations that lets us tell time, that lets us say, well, this is a Marksville culture site, or the people here were somehow associated with Marksville, or this is a Coles Creek site. We can do this through looking at the different decorated ceramics, looking at the different designs. These are all different types. These, for example, right here are what we call Mazik incised, which are Coles Creek and early Plaquemine sherds. Jennifer had shown you a book earlier that came out, Plaquemine Archaeology is the title, of which I have a chapter and co-authored an introduction, in which we look at this culture called Plaquemine, named after not the parish, but the city, Plaquemine, Louisiana, named after the city, actually named after the city because of the mound site, the Medora mound site, which was near it, which was quite close by, which was excavated in the 1940s, in which archaeologists identified a distinctive, several distinctive types of pottery, which they used to tell time, the decoration on the pottery, and said, well, this is a little bit different than the earlier pottery. And it's a little bit different than this later Natchez pottery. So let's call it Plaquemine, literally. Let's call it Plaquemine. Let's call this pottery Plaquemine culture pottery. Sometimes they use the Plaquemine period. We'd say it dates to the Mississippi period. Well, the pottery associated with that culture is found from about the south of the confluence of the Arkansas and Mississippi rivers, southward, all the way to the coast, and eastward from Mississippi, westward into the Chenier Plain. That is to say, it's sort of a lower Mississippi Valley thing. These are not all the mound sites or all the Plaquemine mound sites in this area. These are just some of the mound sites, some of the major mound sites in the western Atchafalaya Basin that I visited with students, at least one of which I see, a couple that I see, who visited these sites, and we did some field schools at. That is to say, we collected really basic information about the people. If we were just going there to collect artifacts, then we wouldn't be much. That is to say, we wouldn't be much different than the collectors who have visited all of these sites for the past 100 years, most of which are unknown and lost for all time. What did Cathcart say? Veiled in the mist of time. People gone there, dug, found things, and left. Well, our goal was to learn something about the people there. And the most basic of questions is, when did they live there? What does the site date to? When was the mound constructed? These are really basic questions, which I have answered for some of these mound sites in a very cursory fashion, just really the first few steps. And then other questions that still need to be answered, such as, what were they eating? What were their lives like? How did they organize their communities economically, politically? All sorts of questions that we can look at. I'll look at one site, SL3, up here on Bayou Rouge, in a little bit more detail, one of the mound sites. It's a very impressive site, and it's, I think, the last site that we had a field school at, the last mound site that we had a field school at. And then I'll just very briefly show you a few slides from three others, Portage Guidry, Portage, and Lauraville. Has anybody seen the Lauraville mound site here? You can't miss it if you drive through Lauraville. A close-up, or hopefully showing that area of Bayou Rouge, Portage Guidry, Portage, and I don't have Lauraville on there, but I'm just going to show that very briefly. Here's Medora, what I had talked about. That is to say, that is the birthplace of Plaquemine culture. That is the place where archaeologists excavating identified this pottery and said, we should make this distinctive culturally and temporally and set it apart and give it this name, Plaquemine. Well, that's where it happened, at Medora, right near Plaquemine, the city. Bayou Rouge. This is a contour map which I made with the students, which I couldn't have made without the students, hacking through the brush, in some places pretty dense. And some of the excavations we did, and very minor excavations. We're not talking about digging enormous excavations into mounds or anything like that. We're talking about trying to find places where people were living, to get some material that we can date and find out when they were living there and when the mounds were built. So how little can we dig? That's almost the goal for a field school. How little can we actually dig and answer some of those questions? Because you don't have that much time for a field school, and the students aren't going to work too hard, right? You know that this is a break, right? You're supposed to be having a good time. So the answer is these are tiny little units. They're only actually about a foot across. They're 50 centimeters. Test unit 7, I'll show you a slide. A couple of other test units, 4 and 5. And then some larger units, 1 and 2, which is actually on the top of a mound, but which actually is mostly in a gully, which was dug out in one of the mounds. This is an incredible site. It's privately owned. I can't really tell you exactly where it is. It's been potted before. That is to say, people have visited it to find artifacts, to keep for themselves, and sort of just use it as sort of a treasure trove. One reason we don't know much about this site. When we went here, we were told it could date anywhere from, we thought, 400 AD to as late as, say, 1700 AD. We didn't have a good idea of what culture it might fit in. Some of those cultures I had talked about, perhaps not Marksville, but perhaps what we call Troyville or Coles Creek or Plaquemine. It's an incredibly interesting site to me because it's so distinct and different than some of these other sites in Acadiana, in the region. Big, flat-top platform mounds. I did my dissertation, my graduate work, at a place called Moundville, and when I went here, Moundville in Alabama, when I went here, I thought, this looks like Moundville. That is to say, this big mound here, Mound D especially, it's a big, flat platform mound that had a building on it. I guarantee you. I don't know that for sure. Is that speculation? Well, I know what the mound dates to, and I've gone up there and seen how level that surface is and the size and the configuration. And knowing what it dates to is important because there were flat-top mounds. There were mounds that Indians built that were flat-topped, which were not burial mounds, which are quite early, Marksville in age, which date before 400 AD, which we don't think were used as places where buildings were placed. What do we call them? Well, some have said they're ceremonial mounds, places for dances or meetings, ceremonial mounds. But this mound, it had a house on top of it, I just know it, or a temple, a big building. Some of these other mounds are unusual. This is the largest and the highest mound. I'll show you pictures of A and D because they're in the clearing. These others were in dense woods when we visited the site. B and C are unusual in that they are stepped, as so they have a lower platform and what looks like a higher platform or a conical mound on top of it. That's the reason why some archaeologists who visited the site early on thought, well, maybe this is a Troyville site. It kind of looks like a site that dates before, say, 700 AD. We really knew absolutely nothing about this site until about 3 years ago when we went there. In fact, it wasn't even in the literature. I couldn't believe it. I mean, I went back, and as of the 1970s, this mound site was not known in the literature. Of course, it was known to local people who visited there and dug there and collected artifacts, but otherwise, it didn't exist. You know, it could have been completely obliterated, and archaeologists wouldn't have missed it because we didn't know about it, really. Of course, it is protected, and the landowners are doing a wonderful job of keeping people off of the site, the people who live there, because they don't want it messed up. After we had mapped the site, some people came in and did a lot of clearing, but this is the large mound, this is Mound A, and you kind of get an idea. The summit is up here, and it's actually obscured by woods. This was actually covered completely like this, the entire mound. That's one of the students holding a mirror that we used to produce that map. That is to say, the digital mapping instrument